Okay, so you know that feeling when you're first learning a new language and it's like everyone's speaking in this like secret code?
Yeah.
Well, today we are going to like totally crack that code.
Yeah.
We are diving deep into second language acquisition and how people learn a new language. And, you know, it's way more predictable than you might think.
It really is. It's fascinating.
Yeah.
You know how babies just kind of pick up language?
Hmm?
Like it's almost magical, but also predictable?
Yeah.
Well, it turns out second language learners, no matter their background, they kind of follow a similar path.
Really?
It's pretty wild.
So you're saying there's a method to the madness.
There really is.
Tell me more about these developmental sequences.
So it all comes down to how we acquire grammatical morphemes.
Okay.
So these are like those little building blocks that we add onto words,
Mm-hmm.
like adding ed for the past tense or an s for plurals.
Right.
And researchers have discovered that there are these like remarkable patterns in how these morphemes they develop in learners
Okay, so you're talking about like grammar rules. Yeah.
that we just use without even thinking about it. Like
Yeah,
as
yeah.
native English speaker, I just know to say played instead of play when I'm talking about yesterday's game.
Exactly. And it's these subtle but crucial grammatical elements that researchers focus on.
Okay.
They analyze learners' language, and specifically, they look for what are called obligatory contexts.
Obligatory contexts.
Yeah. These are situations where a specific grammatical morpheme is absolutely necessary
Right.
for a sentence to be grammatically correct. So, for example, if someone says, yesterday I played baseball,
Yeah.
the word yesterday creates this obligatory context for the past tense,
Right.
even though they haven't quite mastered it yet.
Right. Like it should be there,
Exactly.
even if it isn't.
Exactly. And what's really cool is by analyzing these obligatory contexts, researchers like Stephen Krashen found a pretty consistent order
Wow.
in which learners acquire these grammatical morphemes regardless of their first language.
Interesting.
For example, learners often master adding ing to verbs.
Before they figure out that regular past tense.
Right.
Ed.
Okay.
So even though everyone learns at their own pace and stumbles in different ways, there is this underlying pattern.
So you're saying like our brains all kind of make sense of a new language in this similar way.
Yeah, there are patterns,
That's amazing.
and they're remarkably consistent.
Wow.
Now, remember how we talked about first language influence?
Yeah.
It's not just about the order, but also the pace.
Yeah.
For example, someone who speaks German might grasp English possessive forms quicker than someone who speaks French because of similarities in their native language.
Interesting.
It's like their previous linguistic knowledge gives them a head start.
Oh, so it's like their native language is kind of like whispering in their ear as they're trying to master this new one.
Exactly.
I like that.
Yeah.
So are there any areas where nearly everyone trips up, regardless of their background?
You bet. Articles.
Articles.
Those tiny but mighty acannons and the words,
Yeah.
they tend to be a challenge, even for advanced learners, because mastering when and where to use them correctly is surprisingly tricky.
Oh, tell me about it. I've been trying to learn Spanish and those articles still trip me up
Yeah,
all the time.
it's a common stumbling block.
Why are those so difficult?
Well, that's a great question, and it's one that linguists are still trying to figure out.
Okay.
But one theory is that articles often convey these subtle nuances of meaning
Okay.
that aren't always obvious. For example, they can signal whether something is singular or plural, definite or indefinite.
Right.
So there's more to articles than meets the eye.
Wow. Yeah, they're like these small words with a big job.
Exactly.
Interesting.
Small but mighty.
So, are you ready to dive into the fascinating world of negation?
Oh, yeah.
The art of saying no in a new language?
Let's do it. You're right. There is a lot more to negation than you might think.
Okay, so how does that no journey unfold?
Well, researchers like John Schumann and Henning Wode, they found these like really interesting patterns in how learners acquire negation in a second language. And it turns out this process often mirrors how we learn to say no in our first language.
Wow. So
Yeah.
it's like a universal language learning thing?
It really is. Learners progress through these predictable stages.
So what's the first stage?
It usually starts with learners putting a simple no or not at the beginning of their sentences.
Oh, okay.
So they might say like no bicycle or I know, like it
It's so direct.
is.
It reminds me of how like little kids talk before they figured out all those grammar rules.
Exactly. They're just like getting right to the core message.
Yeah, just like putting it out there.
Exactly. And what's fascinating is even within these early stages, we see whispers of their native language influencing their word order.
Oh, really?
Yeah, like Spanish speakers might hold on to this initial no placement a bit longer because it aligns with how negation often works in Spanish.
So it's like their first language is kind of like a guidepost
It is.
as they're venturing into this uncharted territory.
Yeah.
That's really interesting.
So as learners gain more confidence and they get more experience with the language, they typically start incorporating that auxiliary verb don't into their negative sentences.
So like saying, I don't like it instead of no like it?
Exactly. But here's the thing. You often hear them using don't in ways that might sound a bit off to a native speaker.
Right, right.
You might hear things like, he don't like it, or I don't can sing.
I know exactly what you mean.
Yeah.
It's like you can just tell they're so close.
They are. And, those seemingly small errors,
Right.
they reveal so much about what's going on in their brains as they're learning.
That's so cool.
Like, for example, those German speakers that we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
They might say something like, they come not home.
Okay.
And that's because in German, the verb often comes before the negative element.
Oh, that makes sense.
So they're like transferring that rule over to English.
It's like their brain's like, oh, I've got this like system that works.
Yeah.
Let's just try it here.
Let's see if it works.
Yeah, and see what happens.
Exactly. And eventually, with enough exposure and practice, they'll start to internalize those rules.
Yeah.
But it's those early stages that are so fascinating.
Yeah.
Because we can really see how they're grappling with making sense of this new system.
Totally. Okay, so you mentioned asking questions.
Yes.
Is another area where we see these developmental stages.
Yeah, question formation is like a whole other chapter.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay.
And it's this incredible story of language acquisition.
Okay.
It's another area where we see a predictable progression.
Yeah.
And it's so interesting to see how a learner's first language influences their journey.
Okay, so give me an example. Let's say there's like a group of new language learners and they're trying to like figure out the differences between two pictures or something.
Okay.
And they have to ask questions to get clues, but they're still figuring out the ropes of this new language.
Okay.
Where do they even begin?
It often starts with those like tentative first steps,
Yeah.
single words, or super simple phrases. They might blurt out things like dog or 4 children.
Yeah, just like testing it out.
They're testing the waters.
Yeah.
So as they gain a bit more confidence and their vocabulary expands, they typically move on to what we call declarative word order questions.
Okay.
And these questions sound a lot like simple statements, but with a questioning tone of voice at the end.
Oh, okay. I know exactly what you mean. It's
Yeah.
like instead of saying, is that a cat? They'll be like, that's a cat.
Exactly.
With their voice going up.
And this is where those first language influences can really come through.
Yeah.
Because French speakers, for instance, might hold on to this declarative word order a bit longer because it aligns with how informal questions are structured in French.
Wow. So their like Frenchness is like coming out
It
in
is.
their English.
Yeah.
Interesting.
It's adding a little flair.
Yeah, it is.
So then as they progress even further, they start to use what we call fronting.
Fronting, what's that?
So that just means they start placing those questions, words, like where, what, and why, at the beginning of their questions.
Okay.
But the word order might not be totally accurate yet. So you'll hear them say things like, where the children are playing. Or in this picture, there's 4 astronauts.
So close.
So close.
I'm not quite there yet.
Not quite. But, those little errors are so insightful.
Yeah,
They really highlight how learners are processing the language.
totally. Okay. That makes a lot of sense.
And again, we see those first language influences coming through.
Oh, yeah.
German speakers, for example, at this stage, you might hear them ask questions like baseball.
Okay.
And that's because German allows for this type of word order in questions.
So it's like their brains are like, oh,
Yeah.
we can try this.
Let's apply it over here
Yeah.
and see if it works.
And eventually they get there
They do.
to that correct way.
With enough exposure and practice, they will.
Wow.
But, even when learners seem to have mastered those rules,
Hmm.
those subtle influences from their first language can linger.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So remember those French speakers.
Yeah.
They might still stumble with questions where the subject is a noun instead of a pronoun.
Oh, okay.
For example, they might find the question, why do children like chocolate? Less intuitive to form correctly than other learners.
So even when they've grasped these complex grammar rules,
Yeah,
those early language patterns can still have a really big impact.
they can. It really highlights how intricate language is.
Yeah,
And it reminds us that progress isn't always linear.
that's true.
Learners might breeze through one stage, hit a roadblock at another, and then suddenly leap forward.
Yeah.
There are so many different factors at play.
Right.
Motivation, exposure to the language.
Right.
Even someone's personality can influence how they learn a language.
That's so interesting. It's like everyone's on their own path,
They are.
their own journey.
It's an adventure.
Yeah.
And this brings us to a really important point about language learning.
Okay. Okay. So what's the big takeaway here? What's this profound realization?
Well, it's simply this. Second language learning isn't random. You know, there's a path.
Okay.
And it's actually pretty predictable.
Okay.
And understanding that path can be so empowering for learners.
How so?
Well, it's like having a map
Okay.
to guide you through what can often feel like a really daunting journey.
Yeah. That makes sense.
So instead of feeling lost and confused,
Right.
you can see the landmarks, you can anticipate the turns, you can really appreciate how far you've come.
I love that analogy. It takes away that fear of making mistakes, too.
Exactly.
Because you realize those mistakes are just part of it.
Exactly.
It's part of the journey. It's not like,
It's not the end of the world.
yeah, you're not a failure
Exactly.
because you made a mistake.
And it makes you wonder, like, how could we be doing things differently?
Right.
You know, if we really embrace these developmental sequences.
Yeah. Could we teach languages differently?
Exactly.
Could we learn them differently?
Exactly. Could we accelerate the process
Yeah.
by understanding these natural stages of development a little bit better?
Yeah, and even like help people feel less anxious
Exactly.
about the whole thing.
It's not about being perfect. It's about progress.
I love that. It really makes you think about just how powerful it could be
Yeah.
to understand these patterns.
Yeah. And, you know, it's not just about teaching.
Right.
Imagine being a learner
Yeah.
and being able to recognize these stages in yourself.
Yeah.
Instead of getting discouraged, you could say, oh,
Yeah.
this is totally normal.
It's all part of the process.
This is part of the process. I'm right on track.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, it completely changes your perspective.
It does. Instead of being like, I messed up again.
Right.
It's like, oh no, this is good.
This is good. This means I'm learning.
This is how I learned.
Exactly. It's about celebrating those little victories.
Yeah.
And realizing that every step, every error even, is bringing you closer to fluency.
I love that. This has been so fascinating.
It really is a fascinating topic.
So to all our listeners out there, have you noticed these patterns in your own experiences learning languages? Or maybe you've seen it in other people who are learning languages. Let us know. Share your stories with us.
Yeah, we'd love to hear from you.
Keep this conversation going, and until next time, happy learning.